Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Now and then on this show, I've found various new topics that lead to some really fun trails detouring off the main path. On episode 35 of Classical Ideas, for example, I had a really fantastic discussion about the history of herding and pastoral societies with Linda Kohanov from EponaQuest to discuss societal roles we retain from our species' ancient pastoral history. The lessons we learn from animals and the ongoing interaction and relationships between humans and other species continues to fascinate me. So my guest today is Dr. Margaret Winslow, Professor Emeritus of Earth and Atmospheric Science at City College of New York. She was a field geologist for 3 decades and is the author of 2 travel memoirs recounting her field experiences in South America. Those titles are The Cusp of Dreadfulness, 15 Seasons in Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia, and Over My Head, Journeys in Leaky Boats from the Strait of Magellan to Cape Horn and beyond. She is most recently the author of the book Smart Ass, How a Donkey Challenged Me to Accept His True Nature and Rediscover My Own, out now from New World Library. It is this book and the lessons we have to learn from animals that is the topic of our discussion today. The relationships between humans and animals most definitely fall within the purview of what I see as a classical idea. And even if so, it may be tangential, but that's always fun. So join me on this journey with Margaret Winslow and the story of what she learned from her ornery donkey, Caleb. Margie Winslow, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. It's a pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure too, Greg. I'm very honored to be invited.
Can you just kind of briefly introduce your varied biography to our listeners today?
Okay, I'm a geologist. I spent most of my career as a field geologist, tracking down prehistoric earthquakes in various countries. I taught at City University for 30 years and took early retirement. And so I've worked, I've written 2 travel memoirs that have to do with my work in South America and my misadventures, including, falling out of boats and dodging gunfire and things like that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it wasn't like working in the Appalachians. So anyway, then the rather large turn, I guess in some ways, but a different kind of journey. That is a journey with acquiring a donkey and relationship. So what they have in common, I would say, is personal journey, peppered with lots and lots of misadventures.
Excellent. Well, why don't you go ahead and tell me about your friend Caleb?
Okay. Yeah, Caleb, I found him in an ad in the Brayer, which is the magazine of the American Donkey and Mule Society, and for a large white standard saddle donkey. I wanted a donkey big enough to ride, and I can go into the background of why a donkey at all. But anyway, Caleb is, he's 2 inches too short to be considered a mammoth donkey, but his sire was a mammoth donkey. So he's not like your petting zoo donkeys or your Mediterranean ones. He's about a foot and a half taller than average. So he's about a horse size.
Excellent. And I'm looking at a picture of him right here on the cover of the book, and he has gigantically long ears, doesn't he?
Yes, even for his species. In fact, the publishers initially were playing around with some stock photos, and I really, I wanted to have Caleb's picture on the cover because it is about him and not about a donkey. And his species, which is, or his breed, I should say, not his species. He's an Andalusian saddle donkey, and they're always white, not albinos, but they are white, and they always have extremely long ears.
Yeah.
Even relative to other donkeys.
I love it. Okay, so in your history with Caleb is actually kind of relevant to where I live. I live in Buffalo. I live near Lake Erie, which features in the first chapter of your book. So like the first chapter in the book, I'm just thrilled because this book is about where I live almost in a little tiny way. Can you situate the story for us and how you first met Caleb near my home?
Yes, after I saw that ad, short ad, I called the number and spoke to the owner, Brenda, and found out she lived south of Buffalo. And she sent me a number of pictures. Even though Caleb was 4 years old when I met him, she sent baby pictures, which were to die for, and some stories about him. And so I drove up, 410 miles from
up the 90.
Yep, 87 to 90, and I went to meet him. And it was, I'd like to say, in retrospect, it was sort of love on both sides at first sight. Okay, I was definitely smitten. He was much bigger than I thought he was going to be. Regardless of the fact that she sent me pictures, I somehow looked at the pictures and didn't think of the scale, and I guess I thought she was a midget or something, but this donkey towering over her head, and found out she was a normal height person. So he was the biggest donkey I had seen. I've occasionally seen one or two bigger ones, but he was, I thought, what have I gotten myself into? And meanwhile, Caleb was extremely enthusiastic and was running back and forth along the gate inside the fence and braying. And Brenda said, "Oh, you're the first person who's looked at a would-be purchaser that he's actually liked." And I didn't know if she was just laying it on thick, but I was the fifth person to look at him, she said. And for other people, he would not do anything. He would just stand there like a statue, and they thought he was stupid and, untrainable and blah, blah, blah. And he did everything that I wanted. Now, I didn't realize it was more or less of a one-off, because once I actually owned him, I found out that 95% of the time he did what he wanted to do, and 5% of the time he did what I wanted him to do.
Yeah. So how old? So he was 4 when you met him. Mm-hmm. How old is he now?
He is 21.
Wonderful. He's legal.
Yes.
Good for him.
He had his first adult beverage back in March.
Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to dive into the book because there are so many hilarious anecdotes that are embarrassing, massive struggles, a war of wills. But you begin your book, Smartass, How a Donkey Challenged Me to Accept His True Nature and Rediscover My Own, with a quote from Cervantes in Don Quixote. And the quote reads, "I am glad to have fallen from my donkey, as that experience has shown me truth." Now, I love that you included that. So after all of your life experiences in geology, with your professional successes, your world travel, as you mentioned earlier, what does this Cervantes quote mean to you after many years of those experiences and owning Caleb on the cusp of the 2019 New Year?
Yes. Well, and I acquired him right at the very beginning of the new millennium. What I chose that epigraph because I felt that he forced me to look within myself, to see him as he was, not just as a donkey whose characteristics I read in a book. And being an academic, of course, I read every book I could on donkeys, and making assumptions about him, and then also projecting the desires of me and the trainers to have him do dressage and other show work, that I realized that, he, above all else, with all of our struggles, he always was true to himself. And he forced me to face some things about myself, too.
Excellent. So he so you got him when you were like a full-time professor, very busy teaching classes, and I once upon a time was in a PhD program, but I dropped out. But I know that grind of research and writing and advising and teaching and going to faculty meetings. What do you feel like you had lost with yourself that he kind of forced you to rediscover, so to speak?
Okay, there are a couple of things. One is because of heavy teaching loads and administrative commitments, I was doing very, very little field work. And when I was in the field, I was my best self, and I enjoyed working alone or training students in the field. And I also loved teaching in the classroom. But because of a senior position and I was deputy chair, I had been chair, I had a lot of meetings to go to and endless political things. And there was a big push, and this is not unique to City University, but I've heard of it elsewhere in the country, where there was more and more push towards bringing in money over anything to do with students. And in fact, none of the meetings, I'd come out of a meeting and I'd say, no one mentioned student education, learning, teaching methods. They're all talking about dollars. Mm-hmm. And so it became more and more frustrating that the things that I really loved, I didn't have a lot of time to do.
Yeah. Okay, so you kind of talk in the book as well about how your first memories of donkeys were when you were on a field expedition in the Dominican Republic. Do I have that correct?
That's right, yes.
Okay, so put yourself back in that position. Like, what year was this when you first encountered donkeys in person?
Well, I actually encountered them in the 80s, off and on, but it was in the late 90s shortly before the beginning of this book, that I was working in a rural area near the Haitian border, a very dry area during the dry season. And there were these trains of donkeys going up and down the canyons. And at the bottom of the canyon, there'd be kids filling up, usually milk bottles or jerry cans with water. And then the donkeys would go back up. And I noticed that none of them had any ropes or halters or bridles on them. And they knew where to go. And they went up and down they worked hard, and they looked sort of like horses with low self-esteem or horses with long ears or something, rabbit ears. So anyway, I started noticing them, and I'd see them taking kids to school. They would come back and pick up the kids. They seemed to know what time to do it. They'd carry mom to the market and back, and they would just hang out untied. And I had been horse crazy as a kid and taken lessons until at age 20 I was thrown and injured and became really afraid of riding. So there was a little bit of the love of horses and animals in general, but there was something about these donkeys with their sort of, mohawk haircuts and long ears that made me want to know more about them. And I came back to the States and started going to conferences and shows.
It sounds like they have like a gentleness about them as well.
Yes, they do. They're unlike the horse, which can be graceful, sleek, fleet of foot. The curving neck of the stallion, for example. The donkey looks kind of like, sort of humble.
Yeah.
They've been called that. Of course, I found out that, humility is not really part of their personality. They just look that way. The other thing is their eyes, and I studied it quite a bit being a scientist, looking at what is so compelling, why they look so sad and wise. And they are deeper set than a horse's. And they're under a heavier brow and long eyelashes. And so they sort of look like all the history of the world is on their shoulders.
Oh, I love that. And yet, the introduction and the first few chapters of your book mention that donkeys are very oftentimes neglected or undervalued. And I bet some people who are listening to this show will see the title of this episode and will be like, donkeys, isn't this a show about like religion? Why are we talking about this? But I think that animals are so important to the history of our species and our society and civilizations in general. So why do you make great effort to explain the neglected and undervalued nature of donkeys within the book?
Well, one of the things that struck me initially, even on the surface, was that they are that we need to look at their body language because they can't speak or write. We tend to think of animals as being stupid, and there were decades and decades of behaviorists who said that animals are hardwired, it's instinctive. And this led to a lot of mistreatment and they don't feel pain and they don't feel grief, and we know this is for all animals, mammals at least. They do feel all of the things that humans feel. The thing is, we don't necessarily know how to read their body language, and we have to be willing to be present and observe. And since I was always busy and preoccupied, despite the fact that I got this wonderful donkey, I was often not present. And I realized, as you probably realize as the book goes on, that the more stressed I was at work and the less present I was, the worse Caleb behaved. So he was a perfect mirror. I thought he was being a foil to me, a nemesis, but he was actually mirroring me exactly. And the worse mood I was in, the worse mood he was in. And so I really had to eventually reassess.
Yeah, so you were like almost infecting him with stress that you had accumulated at work and just in our, daily lives that we go through every single day without paying attention to how we actually feel, and we're just going through the motions.
Right, and also setting a goal like, okay, I've got 30 minutes before the stable closes. I've been fighting my way through traffic, all these terrible meetings. I'm frustrated. They're seizing classrooms for entrepreneur. They're renting them out to entrepreneurs and becoming a real estate agency. And I'd be, just grumbling, and I'd show up and I'd say, I got 30 minutes. I want to go in the ring and I want to practice this maneuver with Caleb. And I'd get there and I'd have an agenda.
Yeah.
And there was Caleb, and he was on donkey time. And, it might take me, 30 minutes just to get him out of his stall. And I would be very frustrated because I was goal-oriented and used to, going after challenges. And,
right.
And he became more and more of a challenge until I realized I needed to give him a chance to be himself. And then he was quite willing. I know, I don't know if you want to go into this, but, donkeys in the wild are not herd animals, like horses are herd animals.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so the horse is looking for a herd leader. That herd leader could be a human, and they will submit to a human and put up with some pretty bad treatment too. The donkey will not. They will, if you use negative reinforcement with them, and the whips and the spurs and tying them up short and punishment and deprivation, they just become meaner and meaner, and which is why they have a reputation for, being untrainable and impossible and mean and blah, blah, blah. If you use positive reinforcement, which all of us beings respond to, human, animal, and say, kind of like be a buddy with them, say, we can cross this bridge together. Let's do it. And of course, Caleb will look at it and say, you want to cross that wooden bridge? Go right ahead. I'll watch. But he would respond only to positive reinforcement, and which really was a good thing for me to know and also use in my life in other places.
What do you think he's doing right now?
Let's see. He's probably out in the paddock with one of his girlfriends, There are these two one very large mare and another medium-sized mare who are very fond of him. So he's hanging out there, and he's probably looking from time to time to see if lunch has arrived. Nice.
Very good. So have you studied the domestication of animals in history?
Yeah, I did. It was fascinating to learn that donkeys were domesticated before horses and also before camels. And they were the first beast of burden to be used in North Africa, Egypt, etc., before horses and camels came in. And they were domesticated about 5,000 BC.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And in fact, there's a wonderful archaeologist who's been working in Egypt, and she uncovered a 5,000-year-old grave in which the donkeys had been buried ritually. They'd been honored in death. So not only were they, a beast of burden, but they were considered valuable. They were buried near the king. And this was actually something I only learned 2 years ago. It was just absolutely fascinating that they were honored and esteemed in some places and sometimes.
What cultures were these happening in? Like, where was their first domestication? Do you know?
Yes, North Africa.
Oh, sorry, you said that. I apologize.
Right. So, near present-day Egypt and around the southern Mediterranean, and then eventually around the entire Mediterranean. And one of the things that's fascinated me is that when they started to develop a bad reputation as being stupid, was with the Greeks. And Aesop's fables have some negative stories about donkeys. And I was tracking folklore through, in fact, the last time I was in Spain, I was looking at folk legends and things like that. And actually in Spain, there are a number of really wonderful things about donkeys being wise and being sort of spiritual beings and magical beings. And we know also from Don Quixote that donkeys, Sancho Panza's donkey was very important to him. And this quote that one of the characters in Don Quixote makes, it's the epigraph of the book about, "I'm glad to have fallen from my donkey, for in that way I have seen the truth." I have to tell you a funny thing. I because of another book that relied on online translators that came out with some hilarious translation. Even though I'm fluent in Spanish, so I didn't need a translator. I just started playing around the internet and translating the same quote. So instead of, "I'm glad to have fallen from my donkey, that way I found the truth," one of them translated to, I'm glad I've fallen on my ass, and that's the truth."
Nice.
So anyway, another way of looking at it. But one of the things that I didn't want to push it in the first book, I probably will in the sequel, is that that many people have seen Caleb in a spiritual light. And he does do things like nativity shows and Palm Sunday, and any charity group that asks us to do something, we'll do it. And donkeys are mentioned 150 times in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the word religion earlier, and of course I'm just a compulsive researcher. The donkey is only one of two animals in the Bible that actually speaks.
Really? Okay. So what do they say?
Okay. The one that everybody knows about is the serpent in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Who tempts Eve to take the apple. Okay. The one about the donkey is from the book of Numbers, and it's the story of Balaam, who's he's a prophet of his own people, and the Jewish people are starting to come in, and he wants to confront them. But he's told in a dream to not confront them. But he decides to set out the next day anyway, and his donkey keeps turning aside and tries to scrape him off on a tree that goes into a ditch. And so he's beating this donkey because she would not move forward. And then finally he got off and he said, "I'm going to kill you." And she said, "Haven't I always been faithful to you all these years?" And then an angel appeared, and the angel said, "If your donkey had not turned aside 3 times," in the Bible everything happens 3 times, right? If your donkey had not turned aside, I would have struck you down. And so the donkey was obviously could see the angel. And I thought that's just a wonderful story. I'm consider myself spiritual rather than religious, but it's such a powerful story about a donkey who's wiser than her owner.
Yeah. Well, and I have a dog like that who I feel that way. This dog, I mean, you look in her eyes and there is a depth and a presence that is admirable and incredible.
Yes. What breed is she, Mask?
She's a West Highland Terrier.
Okay.
And you just look at her and she just stares right into you, and it's really quite astonishing.
Yeah, and you have this feeling that they just contain centuries of wisdom.
Absolutely.
If we could only tap into it.
Yeah. So there's this millennia-old relationship between humans and animals that's kind of guiding our conversation right here. And that can be a symbiotic perspective where we rely on each other, or there's also the more violent one of hunter and hunted and things like that. How do you see this relationship between people and animals, especially after owning this difficult but fantastic animal named Caleb?
Well, in terms of the history of domestication, the dog came first, way beyond, like 13,000 years ago. And the funny thing about the dog relationship, they showed up and they were found to be useful as watch animals and would eat up scraps and things, and then help in hunting. In some ways, dogs have had a more complex and sometimes more egalitarian relationship than other animals have. And I think that there's the predator-prey thing that you mentioned earlier, the hunter and hunted. But there's also kind of the master-slave thing that is very common throughout history with the domestication of cows and goats and sheep and donkeys and horses that humans are meant or have taken it upon themselves to dominate animals and have thus denigrated them, underestimated them because they wanted them for a particular chore, to pull a plow or to whatever they wanted them to do. Mm-hmm. They were without looking at them. But many owners. I just came from a veterinary conference in California, and there was a specialty symposium just on donkeys, and there were people from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from the Caribbean, etc. And they were talking about veterinary challenges in poor countries, And what they mentioned in their talks was that even though they themselves were poor, sometimes their biggest asset or only asset outside of their children was their donkey. And that even though they couldn't afford proper veterinary care, they did care about their animals very much. And I'm not surprised by that, but I was touched to hear it because we know that their lives, domestic animals' lives, are pretty harsh in poor countries.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Bible earlier, and in the Bible it says that man should rule over all the beasts of the world and everything like that. Yes. So there's also a very biblical interpretation within that as well. Why do you think that people should care more about learning from animals? Because, obviously, researchers and people that work in universities and veterinarians and people that work with animals learn a lot from animals, but so many people in the world go through their lives now more and more and more detached from animals in general. So why should we care more about learning from animals instead of, being more detached?
Yeah, and we are becoming more and more detached, not only from the natural world and from animals domesticated and wild, but from each other with all of our electronics, which is very worrisome. The thing that animals teach us is they always live in the present. They're not fretting over the past or worried about the future. They are in the present. And one thing I noticed with Caleb is walking down walking through the woods. The leaves are all down now. We've had some snow off and on, but so we walk along, and early on I think, well, I need to get my exercise today, so I'm going to walk this donkey, and I'm going to set a pace. Well, he wants to go about 2.5 miles an hour, and he smells the flowers, and he listens, wonderful big ears, and he made me stop and listen and to use my senses. And that was one thing, a very immediate thing. The other thing is, anybody I know who's had an animal, whether it's a bird or cat or dog or pig, horse, has felt that there's a dimension beyond the obvious. And coming from being a geologist and a scientist, I was a little bit afraid to allow myself to go there. I was trying to be very objective and not project onto him qualities that he didn't have. But many other people, whether it was special needs children or whether it was just people stopping by the stable, would say things about him that he had touched them in some way. And I've seen it happen, and he certainly touched me. And I started to feel that, okay, I can say a little bit more about this. And the wonderful publisher I have, New World Library, fortunately is very open to that sort of thing. In fact, I probably could have gone farther into that spiritual dimension if I'd allowed myself. Maybe I will in the future, but that they offer us something, and even behaviorists who, were doing experiments and talking at conferences about just, action, reaction, and instinct and genetic hardwiring. If they had a pet themselves and you talk to them about it, they'd say, "Oh, but my cat," and they would talk, even though they were completely contradicting their own research bias. They would have their own stories about the dog they grew up with, etc. So I feel that your question was, what I think we need to try to reconnect if we can, not just to go to a petting zoo, although that's a start. Some nursery schools around here actually have animals on the property, and some parents worry about germs and things like that. And I always tell people it's clean dirt.
Yeah,
that's what my mother would say. It's clean dirt. That we need to be aware of what's around us. Whether it's the clouds going by or fireflies at night, and that I'm worried that more and more we're losing this.
Sometimes whenever I'm out on a walk, I have 3 little Westies, and they're very, very stubborn little guys. And whenever one of them will stop and just plant his feet, and I have to wait for him to do whatever he's going to do, his business, I'll just stop and look around, and I'll notice a really beautiful, bed of flowers in a neighbor's yard, or notice a particular way the beams of the sunlight are coming through the clouds at that particular moment. And in those moments, you kind of feel almost childlike again. You know what I mean? Where you think about those days when you were young and you were just laying out in the grass in the backyard, being a kid. And that's kind of what it reminds me of.
Yes, and you said childlike. You know what? It's not childish. You said childlike. That sense of awe, of delight, that you have children, as their world expands, as their eyesight improves, as they take their first steps, and they start to see this world around them. The dominant reaction or emotion is delight. There's some fearful things and caution and things like that, but if they haven't had negative experiences or too many, the dominant thing is awe and delight, and we have tended to lose that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so Caleb is a donkey, and in the book you write about underdogs and misfits, which I just absolutely love. Has what you have learned about underdogs and misfits gone beyond your relationship with Caleb into like other species or people or places around the world?
Well, I'd actually predated my time with the Caleb with Donkey. I always associate with the underdogs and the misfits and the mavericks, and whether it was my first friends in kindergarten or various boyfriends, and my mother would say you date extraterrestrials. I mean, they, I was very interested. Yeah, not the captain of the football team, but rather rather the nerd who always wore a red hat or something. I was really always attracted to people like that. I felt I was one of them. I still do. And never wanting to be, probably never being invited to be in the in crowd, but never really wanting to be in the in crowd, that I was always that way. And I found that when I started teaching, that I tended to spend more time with the students who were non-traditional and didn't fit in than I did with the good ones. The good ones were going to make their way no matter what. So in a way, I was sort of primed for a donkey. In a way, if there's such a thing as a totem animal, when I started reading about donkeys and saw them in person, I realized I felt, and initially it was a projection, I wasn't sure if to trust it, that we were similar in some way at the soul level.
Nice. So, given that Caleb is of a species which has been historically undervalued, judged, neglected, have you learned anything about, like, how people judge each other? We're constantly going through the world judging. So, given that Caleb is from a very judged species, has that taught you anything about the way that people judge each other as well?
Yeah, I think one of the fun things, Caleb is sort of an ambassador for donkeys because there are basically none of them around here, and near the city, New York City, and so people always ask questions. Are they stupid? Are they stubborn? And blah blah blah. Why would you get a donkey? Can you ride them? And so I get to speak on his behalf, and he gets to, he's very affectionate and curious, and so he's letting people know, that a donkey is interesting and different, and so there is that. And I'm trying to think in terms of the way you worded it.
Can I rephrase it as well?
Yes, please.
So check this out. You have probably been judged yourself by other people who have seen you in very difficult situations with Caleb. Tell me a little bit about that feeling of being judged by people who were watching you in these embarrassing anecdotes that you describe in the book.
Okay. Yeah, one of the reviewers called it blatant humiliation.
Oh, it's great. It's wonderful. I mean, it's so well described, and I'm just like feeling your pain, but it's also hilarious. But in the moment, to you, it's not funny. I mean, but later it is, obviously.
Yeah. And now there is some history before donkeys is that, wanting to become a geologist, there were no other women in my classes in the late 60s and 70s. Being the first woman on this research ship going to Antarctica. And I was never, compared to most of my field geologists tend to be athletic. And although I did jog and like to hike, I was never really fast. I was never very strong, but I really, really wanted to do it, and I kept at it. So I really admire people who do that, that are tenacious in their goals, which I also identify with donkeys. So now, having worked with Caleb, and as you mentioned, some of the funniest parts of the book have to do with where he embarrasses me in public. There are a couple of things. One is one of the stories that's actually not in the book is that we were told that we were going on hunter pace that was in Connecticut in sort of fancy hunt country, but it was on Halloween, and I thought that we were supposed to show up in costume. So I showed up dressed like Zorro with a donkey, a big white donkey. And everybody else there is in traditional hunter clothes, with the tweed wool, the jawed furs, the polished boots, the $1,000 worth of stuff, and the beautiful, beautiful sleek horses. And I show up looking like I've just crossed the border. And my husband was so embarrassed. He went and sort of hid. He tried to look like he didn't know me. And so anyway, I just realized, okay, everybody's staring at us, and Caleb's there and being himself. And I thought, we're just going to have to go with this. We can't leave. And we're stuck here for a few hours. So we're just going to go with it. Be yourself. So that was one of the ones. And the thing about donkeys is that, and this is all the trainers will say, you can practice, your dressage to music, and he can do it perfectly. He can do it 50 times in a row. During the day of the show, he might decide to go into the ring and then run out of the ring. Or he might go into the ring and do absolutely nothing. Or he might do it perfectly. And I realized that, okay, one of the things is I've sort of play it for laughs now. We're sort of the comic relief at dressage shows because we always do so terribly. But also it draws people in. Remember the Sydney Olympics where there was a young man who had from Africa, he'd only learned to swim in a tiny swimming pool.
Yeah.
And he almost didn't finish the course. But because everybody else jumped the gun, everyone was eliminated except him. So he swam up and back in the pool, started doing the dog battle, and everybody cheered him on. It was like, go, you'll make it.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing, you were talking about underdogs and misfits and sort of hopeless cases. The thing that Caleb brings out in me, and I think in other people, is this thing of cheering on the underdog. We're always the last in races. We'll have 110 horses pass us, even if we have a head start. People look at, I hopefully look at life a little differently after they see this ridiculous rider and her donkey going around.
Nice. So he's put you in so many tremendously embarrassing situations, which you describe very fully and humiliatingly in the book, to great comedic effect, I might add. Which of the stories make you laugh the most when you think back on them over your years of owning him?
Oh, boy. There were so many that I could not include. And, of course, that one I told you about, the costume thing.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's going in the sequel. One that really makes me laugh, that's in the book?
Either way, whatever springs to mind.
Yeah.
I love the idea of having this conversation and not ruining the book for potential readers, so you can tell me whatever you want.
Okay. There was one show just in the last year and a half where, we came into the ring. It was dressage to music, and start the music. Caleb comes into the ring, and he runs out of the ring. So then I can't get him to get back in there. So somebody comes up with a whip and sort of chases him back into the ring. So they start the music again, and we go. And then at the end of it, we're supposed to be in the center line, and we bow. And then Caleb walked forward, and he kept walking forward till he was right in the judge's face. He just kind of looked, stuck his big mug in her face, and she was heard to remark, "Now I've seen everything." Anyway, there's so many funny stories, and I'm having been living with them and writing them. I think what I've noticed from readers and reviewers is they often pick some of the stories that I wouldn't necessarily have picked as the funniest. I guess maybe because I've laughed so many times.
I love the one of him being like in the middle of the iced over parking lot, and if you guys try to get out, you'll probably fall, and then there will be a stranded donkey in the ice in the middle of a parking lot where people are trying to pull in. Like, that was amazing. Do you still get mad at him whenever he does what he's going to do? Because in the very beginning of the book, you're constantly angry at him.
Yeah.
Do you still feel the same way whenever he does whatever he wants to do?
Yeah, no. In the beginning, I was very sensitive to public humiliation. And a friend of mine who's a psychologist said, if you're sensitive to being laughed at in public, why did you pick the one animal most likely to humiliate you in public? And I had this, okay. Yes. But I don't now. Part of it is I sort of know his repertoire, although he always has a new wrinkle on things, and so I can't remember the last time I've been angry with him. I know other people have been angry with him. We were at upstate New York in Schoharie, the Schoharie Sunshine Fair. It's a pretty big fair, and it has donkey mule show, and we. Well, I came to this stable. I was sleeping not at the fair at my sister-in-law's house, and I came just after dawn, and there was this big sheriff came over, and he said to me, "That there your mule?" And I said, "No, he's a donkey." And he said, "He woke up the whole goddamn park. He woke up the dairy barn, the goats, everybody's been going since 4:30 in the morning." well, that was my boy.
Yeah.
I could not be angry with him.
Nice. So the subtitle of your book says that he helped you rediscover your true nature. And I'm curious, like, what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. Like, just a normal everyday. How do you carry that lesson with you into your everyday life?
Okay, I felt as a professor and one of the few women in my field, I had to sort of adopt a persona of being very strong and somewhat conservative, and that I felt that I was constantly visible and being judged. In the early years, I probably was being judged, that I needed to do everything a certain way. So I was Professor Winslow. And what I started to feel after I got Caleb, I started to speak out more at work, speak up, and also I just felt more comfortable with being myself. And also laughing at some of the absurdities of life. So yeah, that's some of it.
You rediscovered your own underdog nature, didn't you?
I did, and
Wonderful.
my inability. I was very tenacious and independent, like a donkey, but also non-aggressive. Donkeys are not aggressive, and so I was unwilling to confront. And in this sort of Darwinian environment at the university, I could not, I could wring my hands and grumble and, mutter and things like that, but, and get migraine headaches, but I could not confront. And with Caleb, I felt not confront in the way of pushing, but in terms of speaking up, of being myself, the way Caleb always is himself.
Well, Margie Winslow, we're coming to the end of our time here today, but I have absolutely loved speaking with you today. This is hilarious and fantastic, and there's so many great lessons to learn. And the book is an absolute riot, and I felt so badly for you in the book because I was laughing so hard at so many of the situations, but they're just wonderful. So I think that everybody should check it out if you're looking for something a little different, especially if you love animals. This is a book filled with fantastic bits of wisdom. Do you have any sign-off words or suggestions or recommendations that the audience can pursue? Okay,
a couple things. Even though everyone knows me as Margie, the you'll have to look it up under Margaret Winslow.
Margaret Winslow, yes.
Because sometimes people can't find it who know me. Some sign-off things. I would look to spend more time with animals in nature without being goal-oriented. I probably like you are. I want to go on a 10-mile hike and the dog keeps stopping and won't go anywhere. To be more open and just, follow them around and look at what they're doing and pay attention because they communicate beautifully. It's just that we are not used to reading body language, and we can learn so much more if we do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. Thanks, Margie.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com. Or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.